Marcus had been a deputy back then, 26 years old and fresh out of the academy, eager to prove himself in the place where he'd grown up. Now his temples were gray. His joints ached on cold mornings, and he carried the weight of 16 years of unanswered questions. The case file sat in the bottom drawer of his desk, worn at the edges from being pulled out and examined on sleepless nights. Sarah Mitchell, 17 years old, honor student, volunteer at the Baptist Church. Last seen walking home from her shift at the Piggly Wiggly on October 14, 2008. The dock creaked behind him, and Marcus turned to see Deputy Angela Reeves approaching with 2 steaming cups of coffee from the gas station. She was 32, sharp as a tack, and had grown up hearing about Sarah Mitchell the way other kids heard fairy tales. In Meridian County, Sarah's story was the monster under the bed. The warning mothers gave their daughters about being careful, about not trusting too easily. DNA results came back, Angela said quietly, handing him a cup. Her dark eyes were serious, reflecting the gray sky. It's a match. Marcus's hand trembled slightly as he took the coffee. After all these years of dead ends and false leads, of watching Sarah's mother Ellen age a decade in what should have been a year, of seeing the hope drain out of her father's eyes at every anniversary vigil. After all of that, they finally had something real. Tell me, he said. Angela pulled out her phone, scrolling through the email from the state crime lab. The hair sample we found in the evidence box, the one that was collected from Sarah's bedroom window frame, it matches a profile in the database. Recent upload from a genealogy site. Guy did one of those ancestry tests last month. Who is it? Angela's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. James Johnson. The name hit Marcus like a physical blow. He took a step back, coffee sloshing over the rim of his cup. That's not possible. I triple-checked. It's him. James Johnson. The man who'd organized the search parties when Sarah first went missing. The one who'd posted flyers on every telephone pole from Meridian to Montgomery. The high school guidance counselor who'd spoken at Sarah's memorial service, his voice breaking as he talked about her potential, her kindness, her future that had been stolen. James Johnson, who for 16 years had been one of the most respected men in the community, who'd helped dozens of troubled kids turn their lives around, who'd never missed a Sunday at First Baptist, who'd married his college sweetheart Dorothy and raised 3 children in the white colonial on Magnolia Street. The rain intensified, hammering the surface of the creek until it looked like it was boiling. Marcus thought about the evidence they'd collected back in 2008. The shoes on the dock, a torn piece of Sarah's jacket found half a mile downstream, and that single strand of hair caught on a rough edge of the window frame at the Mitchell house. They'd tested it back then, but the technology wasn't what it is now. The profile had sat in the evidence room for 16 years, waiting for science to catch up. Where is he now? Marcus asked. At the school. It's Tuesday. He'll be there until 4. Marcus looked at his watch. 2:47 p.m. He thought about James Johnson sitting in his office right now, probably meeting with some kid who was struggling in algebra or dealing with problems at home. He thought about Dorothy Johnson, who taught 2nd grade and brought homemade cookies to every PTA meeting. He thought about their children. Sarah Johnson was 28 now, married with a baby. Michael was 25, working at his father-in-law's hardware store. And Emma, the youngest at 22, was in nursing school in Birmingham. Get Judge Patterson on the phone, Marcus said. We need a warrant. And call in Ray and Thomas. I want 4 of us when we go in. Angela nodded and started making calls. Marcus turned back to the creek, watching the water carry leaves and branches downstream. Somewhere in the back of his mind, he'd always known they'd find Sarah's killer eventually. He'd imagined this moment countless times, the satisfaction of justice, the relief of closure. But he'd never imagined it would feel like this, like the ground was opening up beneath his feet. Because if James Johnson had killed Sarah Mitchell, if he'd stood up at her memorial and spoken about her with tears in his eyes while knowing what he'd done, then everything Marcus thought he knew about his town, about the people in it, about his own judgment, all of it was wrong. An hour later, Marcus stood in the parking lot of Meridian County High School with Angela, Deputy Ray Morrison, and Deputy Thomas Grant. The brick building looked the same as it had when Marcus had graduated from there in 1995. the same faded Go Wildcats banner, the same oak trees that had been old when his grandmother was young, the same football field where generations of boys had dreamed of glory. "He's in his office," Ray said, checking his phone. "Secretary says he doesn't have any students scheduled for the next 30 minutes. Marcus felt his stomach tighten. "Let's go." They walked through the front doors into the familiar smell of floor wax and teenage anxiety. Principal Helen Watkins met them in the lobby, her face pale. Word had already spread among the staff. Small towns didn't keep secrets long, and she looked like she might be sick. "This has to be a mistake," she whispered. "James is. He's one of the best people I know." Marcus didn't answer. He'd learned long ago that everyone was capable of hiding something, and the people who seemed the most trustworthy were often the ones with the most to hide. They walked down the hallway past trophy cases and student artwork, past lockers covered in stickers and photos, past classroom doors where teachers were wrapping up their lessons for the day. James Johnson's office was at the end of the hall, door partially open. Marcus could see him through the window, sitting at his desk, reading glasses perched on his nose as he reviewed some paperwork. He looked like what he was, a 54-year-old man who dedicated his life to helping kids, who wore cardigans and khakis, who had pictures of his grandchild on his desk next to a jar of peppermints he kept for students who needed something sweet. Marcus knocked on the doorframe. James looked up, and for just a moment, a fraction of a second, something flickered across his face. Fear? Recognition? Then it was gone, replaced by his usual warm smile. The rain came down in sheets that November afternoon, turning the red clay roads of Meridian County into rivers of rust. Sheriff Marcus Webb stood at the edge of Miller's Creek, watching the water churn and foam around the cattails that lined the bank. This was where they'd found Sarah Mitchell's shoes 16 years ago, a pair of white canvas sneakers, still tied, placed side by side on the wooden dock like she'd simply stepped out of them and walked into the water. But Sarah Mitchell hadn't drowned. She'd disappeared. And in a town of 3,000 souls, disappearances didn't happen without leaving scars that never quite healed. He thought about Sarah Mitchell, about those white sneakers on the dock, about 16 years of questions. And he thought about Dorothy Johnson, who would be at the elementary school right now, teaching a lesson on addition or reading a story to her second graders, with no idea that her entire life was about to implode. The drive to the county jail took 12 minutes. Nobody spoke. The radio crackled with traffic, and Marcus could hear other units being dispatched to the Johnson house on Magnolia Street, to Dorothy's school, to coordinate the media response that would be needed. This wasn't just an arrest. This was an earthquake, and the aftershocks would reshape Meridian County in ways no one could predict. As they pulled into the jail complex, Marcus glanced back at James one more time. The man was still crying, still staring at nothing. And Marcus wondered, not for the first time and certainly not for the last, how many other secrets were buried in this town, waiting for the rain to wash away enough dirt to expose them to the light. James Johnson had always been an early riser. Even now, sitting in the holding cell at the Meridian County Jail, his body clock told him it was 5:30 a.m., the time when he'd normally be shuffling into his kitchen in his bathrobe and slippers, starting the first pot of coffee, looking out the window at his backyard where the bird feeder hung from the oak tree. Dorothy used to tease him about his obsession with routine. "You're like clockwork, James," she'd say, kissing his cheek before heading off to her own early morning routine of shower, makeup, the careful selection of comfortable shoes for a day spent on her feet with 7-year-olds. But Dorothy wasn't here now. The lawyer they'd assigned him, a young woman named Christina Torres from the public defender's office, had told him that Dorothy had been taken to her sister's house in Birmingham. She was not ready to see him yet, Christina had said carefully, and James had nodded because what else could he do? His children weren't returning his calls. His friends from church had gone silent. In less than 24 hours, his entire life had been reduced to a 6-by-8-foot cell with a metal toilet and a thin mattress that smelled of industrial disinfectant. James stood up from the bunk and did what he always did when anxiety threatened to overwhelm him. He made a list. It was a habit he'd developed in college, during finals week when the pressure felt insurmountable. He'd taught the technique to countless students over the years. Break the big problem into small pieces, he'd tell them. Focus on what you can control. But what could he control now? He couldn't control the DNA evidence that apparently put him at Sarah Mitchell's house on the night she disappeared. He couldn't control the fact that 16 years of being a good person, a helpful person, a person who showed up for his community, none of that mattered now. He couldn't control the way people would look at him, the assumptions they would make, the way his name would become synonymous with the worst thing that had ever happened in Meridian County. A guard walked by, and James instinctively turned his face toward the wall. The guard didn't say anything. They weren't cruel here, just distant, professional. But James felt the weight of judgment anyway. He'd lived his whole life trying to be the kind of man people respected. He'd grown up watching his father work 2 jobs to keep food on the table, watching his mother stretch every dollar until it screamed. He'd been the first person in his family to go to college, scholarship to Auburn, graduated with honors in education. He'd come back to Meridian County because he wanted to give back, wanted to be the person who helped kids see their potential even when the world told them they didn't have any. And he'd been good at it. God, he'd been good at it. There were former students all over Alabama who would tell you that James Johnson changed their lives. Tommy Perkins, who'd been failing every class his junior year and was now a nurse in Mobile. Rachel Chun, who'd been so shy she couldn't speak in front of the class and was now a teacher herself. Marcus Webb's own nephew, Danny, who'd been heading down a bad path with drugs and petty crime until James had sat him down every day after school for 3 months. Just talking, just being present until the kid found his footing again. James sat back down on the bunk and put his head in his hands. That was the worst part. Not the jail cell, not the humiliation, but the thought that all those kids he'd helped would now question whether it had been real. Would they wonder if he'd had ulterior motives? Would they lie awake at night, revisiting every interaction, every time he'd put a hand on their shoulder or given them a hug after they'd shared something painful? The thing was, James couldn't remember being at Sarah Mitchell's house that night. He remembered the day she disappeared. Everyone in town did. It was the day that divided. Marcus, what brings you by? James started to stand, then saw the other deputies, saw their serious expressions, and slowly sat back down. His smile faded. What's going on? Marcus stepped into the office, his hand resting on his belt near his handcuffs. James Johnson, I need you to stand up and place your hands behind your back. You're under arrest for the murder of Sarah Mitchell. The color drained from James's face. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. Behind Marcus, he could hear Helen Watkins gasp. Someone in the hallway dropped something that clattered on the tile floor. This is insane, James finally said, his voice hoarse. Marcus, you know me. You've known me for 30 years. I would never. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. We have DNA evidence placing you at the scene, Marcus said, surprised by how steady his own voice was. Sir, please stand up. James's hands were shaking as he gripped the edge of his desk. DNA? What DNA? I helped search for Sarah. I was at the Mitchell house. Of course my DNA would be. The sample was collected from inside her bedroom window, Angela said quietly. From the night she disappeared. James's face crumpled. He looked suddenly old, ancient, like he'd aged 20 years in 20 seconds. Tears spilled down his cheeks, and he covered his face with his hands. For a long moment, the only sound was his ragged breathing and the distant bell signaling the end of the school day. When he finally lowered his hands, his eyes were red and hollow. I need a lawyer. That's your right, Marcus said. He moved forward and gently helped James stand, guiding his hands behind his back. The handcuffs clicked closed with a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the small office. You have the right to remain silent. As Marcus read James his rights, he was aware of the growing crowd in the hallway. Teachers, students, staff, all standing frozen, watching in disbelief as one of the pillars of their community was led away in handcuffs. Someone was crying. Someone else was on their phone, and Marcus knew that within minutes, the entire town would know. Walked James through the school and out to the patrol car. The rain had stopped, leaving everything wet and gleaming. Marcus helped James into the back seat, one hand on his head the way they always did. As he closed the door, he found himself face to face with James through the window. The man was staring straight ahead, tears still streaming down his face, his lips moving in what might have been a prayer. Marcus got into the driver's seat, and they pulled out of the parking lot. In his rearview mirror, he could see the crowd of people standing in the rain-soaked parking lot, their faces painted with shock and confusion. Time in Meridian County into before and after. But his specific memories of that evening they are fuzzy, blurred by the shock that had come in the days that followed. He'd been home with Dorothy, hadn't he? They'd watched something on TV, gone to bed early. Or had Dorothy been at her book club that night? The details felt slippery, like trying to hold water in his cupped hands. Cristina Torres had asked him to write down everything he remembered about October 2008. It was hard to focus on 1 month when you were asked to reach back 16 years. James remembered that it was the fall of the financial crisis. Every day the news showed people losing their jobs, losing their homes. He remembered that Sarah had come to see him a few times that semester, worried about her grades in calculus, asking about college applications. She'd been a good kid, maybe a little naive, definitely sheltered. Ellen and Tom Mitchell had raised her in the church, kept her close, maybe too close. Sarah had chafed at the restrictions. James remembered that. She'd wanted to go to college out of state, somewhere bigger than Alabama, somewhere she could be someone different. Had he encouraged that? He thought he had. It was his job to help kids spread their wings, to imagine futures beyond the town limits. But now even that memory felt contaminated, like maybe there was something wrong with a middle-aged man telling a teenage girl to dream big, to want more. James stood up again and paced the small cell. 5 steps from the door to the back wall. 5 steps back. He'd done this same pacing in his office at school when he was working through a problem, trying to figure out how to help a student who was struggling with something at home. The motion helped him think. What did he actually know? The police said they had DNA, a hair from Sarah's bedroom window. But he'd been at the Mitchell house before. Lots of times. He'd gone there for a fundraiser once, back when Tom Mitchell was running for city council. He'd dropped off some information about scholarships when Sarah was a junior. He'd probably been there for other things too, community events, the kind of stuff everyone did in a small town where your personal life and your professional life bled together until there were no clear boundaries. But the bedroom window. He tried to picture the Mitchell house. A modest ranch-style home on Sycamore Street, yellow siding, green shutters, a porch with a swing where Ellen liked to sit in the evenings. Sarah's bedroom had been on the side of the house, he thought, or was it the back? He'd never been inside her bedroom. He was certain of that. You didn't go into students' bedrooms. That was a line you never crossed, a boundary that was sacred. So how had his DNA gotten there? The question circled in his mind like water going down a drain. He thought about the search parties after Sarah disappeared. He'd been part of the group that covered the neighborhoods east of downtown, walking through yards, looking in sheds and abandoned buildings, calling her name until their voices were hoarse. Had he been near the Mitchell house during the search? He must have been. Everyone had been near the Mitchell house. It was Command Central, the place where volunteers checked in, where Ellen handed out flyers with Sarah's picture, where Tom stood looking hollow-eyed and desperate. Maybe that was it. Maybe the DNA had been transferred somehow, contaminated evidence. Cristina had mentioned that possibility, said she'd be looking into the chain of custody, questioning how the sample had been stored for 16 years. But even as James grasped at that hope, he felt a gnawing doubt. The police wouldn't have arrested him if the evidence wasn't solid. Marcus Webb was thorough, careful. He wouldn't have come to James's office, wouldn't have put handcuffs on him in front of the entire school, unless he was certain. The morning grew lighter outside the small window near the ceiling of his cell. James could see a rectangle of sky turning from black to gray to pale blue. On a normal day, he'd be at the kitchen table now, reading the newspaper, doing the crossword puzzle while Dorothy graded spelling tests. They'd talk about their plans for the day, share little observations about nothing in particular. After 32 years of marriage, they developed a comfortable rhythm, a shared language of small gestures and inside jokes. What was Dorothy thinking right now? Was she angry? Heartbroken? Did she believe he was capable of this? James had never kept secrets from her, or at least he'd never thought he did. Their relationship had been built on honesty, on showing up for each other through the hard times. When Dorothy's mother had died, James had held her every night for weeks while she cried. When he'd struggled with anxiety in his 30s, bad enough that he'd needed medication and therapy, Dorothy had driven him to every appointment, had never made him feel weak or broken. Surely she knew him well enough to know he couldn't have hurt Sarah Mitchell. Surely their life together meant something, counted for something against this accusation. But then James thought about all the true crime documentaries Dorothy liked to watch, cases where the wife or husband said they'd had no idea, genuinely believed their spouse was incapable of violence. You never really know someone, the detectives always said. Everyone has secrets. Did he have secrets? James searched his memory, trying to find gaps or shadows, moments he couldn't account for. There was his senior year of college when he'd blacked out at a party after drinking too much. He'd woken up in his dorm room with no memory of how he'd gotten there. There was the year after his father died when he'd been so depressed he'd sometimes lose track of entire afternoons, finding himself in his car in random parking lots with no memory of driving there. But those were different. Those were lapses, not secrets. And none of them were violent. A tray slid through the slot in the door. Breakfast. Powdered eggs, toast, a small carton of orange juice. James's stomach turned. He couldn't remember the last time he'd eaten, but the thought of food made him nauseous. Still, he forced himself to take a few bites of toast. Another thing he'd learned over the years: take care of the body, and the mind follows. Eat, sleep, exercise, maintain routine. He thought about his morning routine at school. He always got there by 7:15, even though he didn't have to be there until 7:45. He liked to have that quiet time in his office before the day began. Time to organize his thoughts, review his schedule, prepare for whatever crises might emerge. Because there were always crises in a high school. Kids dealing with breakups, family problems, failing grades, bullying, substance abuse. James had seen it all, had learned to read the signs, to know when a student was just having a bad day versus when they were in real trouble. He thought about his morning routine at school. He always got there by 7:15, even though he didn't have to be there until 7:45. He liked to have that quiet time in his office before the day began. Time to organize his thoughts, review his schedule, prepare for whatever crises might emerge. Because there were always crises in a high school. Kids dealing with breakups, family problems, failing grades, bullying, substance abuse. James had seen it all, had learned to read the signs, to know when a student was just having a bad day versus when they were in real trouble. Sarah Mitchell had been in real trouble. He saw that now, looking back with the clarity of hindsight. She'd come to his office more frequently in the weeks before she disappeared. She'd been anxious about something, distracted. He'd attributed it to normal teenage stress, college applications, SAT prep, trying to maintain her grades while working part-time at the Piggly Wiggly. But maybe there had been more to it. Maybe she'd been scared of something or someone. Had she told him something he'd forgotten? Had she confided in him and he'd missed the warning signs? The guilt was immediate and overwhelming. If he'd been more attentive, more perceptive, could he have prevented what happened to her? Even if he wasn't responsible for her death, and he couldn't be, was he responsible for not saving her? James set down the tray and lay back on the thin mattress. The ceiling was stained with water damage, yellow-brown splotches that looked like continents on a map. He used to play a game with his kids when they were little, finding shapes in clouds. Sarah would see a horse. Michael would see a dinosaur. Emma would see a princess castle. They'd lie in the backyard on summer afternoons, grass prickling their bare arms, making up stories about the shapes they found. When had he stopped doing that? When had the simple pleasures of fatherhood been replaced by the constant grind of work and responsibility? He'd been so focused on helping other people's children that sometimes he wondered if he'd neglected his own. Sarah was married now, and he'd barely gotten to know her husband before this arrest. Michael worked long hours at the hardware store, and James couldn't remember the last time they'd had a real conversation, something beyond surface-level pleasantries. And Emma, his baby, was off at nursing school, living her own life, probably relieved to be away from Meridian County and all its small-town drama. Would they visit him? Would they stand by him? Or would they assume the worst like everyone else seemed to be doing? The sound of doors clanging open and closed echoed through the jail. James heard voices, footsteps, the routine sounds of mourning in a place where freedom was just a memory. He thought about all the students he'd worked with over the years who'd ended up in places like this or worse. He'd always believed in second chances, in rehabilitation over punishment. He'd written letters to judges, advocated for alternatives to incarceration, argued that kids could change if given the right support. Now he was on the other side of that equation, and he understood viscerally what he'd only understood intellectually before. The justice system wasn't designed for nuance. It was designed for guilt or innocence, black or white, criminal or victim. There was no space for complexity, for the thousand shades of gray that made up a human life. A guard appeared at his cell door. Officer Hendricks, a young guy maybe 25, who James vaguely recognized from church. "Torres is here," he said. "Attorney visit." James stood up, smoothed down his orange jumpsuit, and followed Hendricks down the corridor. They walked past other cells, and James kept his eyes on the floor. He didn't want to see the other inmates, didn't want to acknowledge that he was one of them now. Cristina Torres was waiting in a small room with a metal table and 2 plastic chairs. She was younger than James had initially thought, maybe 30, with dark hair pulled back in a professional bun and intelligent eyes behind black-framed glasses. She had a laptop open and several folders spread across the table. "Mr. Johnson," she said, gesturing for him to sit. "How are you holding up?" It was such a normal question, the kind of thing you ask someone at church on Sunday morning, that James almost laughed. How was he holding up? His life was destroyed. His family was hiding from him, and he was facing murder charges for a crime he didn't remember committing. "I've been better," he said, sitting down. His voice sounded strange to his own ears, hollow, defeated. Cristina nodded sympathetically. "I know this is overwhelming, but I need you to focus for me. Okay? I've been going over the evidence, and I have some questions." For the next hour, they went through everything. Cristina asked about his relationship with Sarah Mitchell. Purely professional, he insisted. She asked about his whereabouts on October 14, 2008, home with Dorothy, he thought, though the memories were hazy. She asked about his involvement in the search efforts, extensive, he'd been out every day for 2 weeks. She asked if he'd ever been inside the Mitchell house, yes, a few times, for community events. She asked if he'd ever been in Sarah's bedroom. Absolutely not. Never. The DNA sample was a single hair found on the exterior window frame of Sarah's bedroom, Cristina explained. It was caught on a rough edge where the paint had chipped. The prosecution's theory is that you were outside her window the night she disappeared, possibly watching her, possibly attempting to gain entry. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. James felt bile rise in his throat. "That's insane. I would never." "I believe you," Cristina said, and the kindness in her voice almost undid him. "But we need to figure out how that hair got there. Contamination is possible. Transfer from another location is possible. We'll be demanding to see the full chain of custody, checking if proper protocols were followed during the original investigation and during storage." "What are my chances?" James asked. The question came out as barely a whisper. Cristina was quiet for a moment, and in that silence, James felt his hope crumble. "DNA evidence is compelling," she finally said. "Juries trust it, but cases have been won against DNA before. We'll examine every angle, collection procedures, storage conditions, the possibility of coincidental matches or contamination. We'll build a character defense, show who you really are, what you've contributed to this community. We'll find alternative explanations for how that hair could have ended up where it did." "But you think I'll be convicted?" James said. Cristina met his eyes. "I think we have a very difficult fight ahead of us, but I'm going to fight it with everything I have." After Cristina left, James was led back to his cell. The guard, Hendricks, was quiet during the walk. James wondered what he was thinking, this young man who'd probably heard James speak at church about grace and redemption. Did Hendricks think he was guilty? Did it matter? Back in his cell, James sat on the bunk and closed his eyes. He tried to pray, but the words wouldn't come. He'd been a man of faith his entire life, had built his career and his relationships on the foundation of his belief in goodness, in redemption, in the possibility of change. But now, faced with the destruction of everything he'd built, he couldn't find God anywhere in the darkness. Instead, he found himself thinking about Sarah Mitchell. Not the memorial service Sarah, frozen in time at 17, forever perfect and tragic. But the real Sarah, the girl who'd chewed on her pen cap when she was nervous, who'd laughed too loud at jokes that weren't that funny, who'd been desperately trying to figure out who she was and who she wanted to be. He thought about the last time he'd seen her, just a few days before she disappeared. She'd come to his office after school, wanted to talk about Stanford's early admission program. She'd been excited, talking fast, her whole face lit up with possibility. James had filled out the recommendation form for her, had written about her determination, her kindness, her potential to make a real difference in the world. "Do you think I can do it, Mr. Johnson?" she'd asked. "Do you think I'm smart enough to get in?" "Sarah," he'd said, "you're one of the brightest students I've ever worked with. Don't let anyone make you doubt yourself." She'd smiled, and for a moment she'd looked so young, so vulnerable. "My parents want me to stay close to home. They think I should go to Auburn or Alabama, somewhere I can come back on weekends. But I want something different. I want to see what else is out there." "That's normal," he'd assured her. "Parents always struggle with letting go. But you have to live your own life." Had that conversation somehow led to her death? Had he encouraged her to push boundaries that should have remained in place? The guilt twisted in his stomach, physical and sharp. James lay down on the bunk and stared at the ceiling. 5,760 hours in 16 years. That's how long Sarah Mitchell had been gone. And in every one of those hours, someone, her parents, her friends, the people of Meridian County, had wondered what happened to her, had hoped for answers, had imagined scenarios that ranged from hopeful to horrific. Now they thought they had their answer. They thought James Johnson, trusted educator and pillar of the community, was a monster who'd been hiding in plain sight for 16 years. And the worst part, the part that kept James awake as the day faded into another long night, was that he couldn't prove them wrong. The Meridian County Courthouse was built in 1887, a red brick structure with white columns and a clock tower that had stopped working in 1952. No one had ever bothered to fix it, so the clock perpetually read 3:42, as if time had frozen at some arbitrary moment and never moved forward. Marcus Webb thought about that clock as he watched James Johnson being led into the courtroom for his arraignment. Hands cuffed behind his back, orange jumpsuit replaced by an ill-fitting gray suit that Christina Torres had brought from his house. The gallery was packed. Every seat filled, people standing in the back, reporters from Birmingham and Montgomery pressed against the walls with cameras and notepads. Marcus recognized faces from all corners of Meridian County. Teachers from the high school, members of First Baptist Church, parents of students James had worked with, and in the front row, Ellen and Tom Mitchell. Ellen Mitchell looked like she'd aged another 5 years in the past 3 days. Her hair, which had gone gray after Sarah's disappearance, was now completely white. She clutched a tissue in one hand and Tom's arm with the other, her knuckles pale with the force of her grip. Tom stared straight ahead at James with an expression Marcus couldn't quite read. Was it hatred? Relief? Both? Dorothy Johnson sat on the opposite side of the courtroom, as far from the Mitchells as possible. Her sister Susan was beside her, and Marcus could see Dorothy's hands trembling in her lap. She wasn't looking at James, hadn't looked at him since he'd walked in. Her eyes were fixed on some point above the judge's bench, as if she could will herself out of the room through sheer force of concentration. Judge Patricia Harmon entered, and everyone stood. She was 68, had been on the bench for 23 years, and was known for running a tight courtroom. "Be seated," she said, settling into her chair and pulling the case file toward her. "We're here for the arraignment of James Thomas Johnson, charged with the murder of Sarah and Mitchell. Mr. Johnson, please rise." James stood, Christina Torres beside him. Marcus watched the man's face, looking for some crack in the facade, some sign of guilt or innocence. But James just looked tired, defeated, like he'd already been convicted in every way that mattered. District Attorney Raymond Phillips stood up, buttoning his jacket. He was 49, ambitious, with his eye on a run for Attorney General in the next election. This case was exactly what he needed: high-profile, sympathetic victim, clear evidence. Your Honor, the state charges James Thomas Johnson with murder in the first degree. DNA evidence conclusively places the defendant at the victim's residence on the night of her disappearance. Sarah Mitchell was 17 years old, a student at the school where Mr. Johnson worked as a guidance counselor. This is a clear abuse of power, a betrayal of trust, and we will prove beyond reasonable doubt that James Johnson is responsible for her death. Christina Torres stood. Your Honor, my client maintains his complete innocence. The DNA evidence in question is 16 years old and potentially contaminated. Mr. Johnson had legitimate reasons to be at or near the Mitchell residence in his capacity as a school counselor and community member. We will show that the evidence has been misinterpreted and that Mr. Johnson is the victim of a rush to judgment in a case that has haunted this community for too long. Judge Harmon made notes on her pad. How does your client plead? Not guilty, Your Honor, Christina said. So entered. Now, on the matter of bail. The state opposes bail, Raymond Phillips interrupted. Mr. Johnson is a flight risk. He has no prior record because he was never caught. But the severity of this crime and the overwhelming evidence against him make him a danger to the community. Your Honor, Christina countered. Mr. Johnson has lived in Meridian County his entire adult life. He has deep ties to this community, a family here, a career spanning 3 decades. He is not a flight risk, and there is no evidence he poses any danger to anyone. He's been a model citizen. He's a murderer, a voice called from the gallery. Marcus turned to see Ellen Mitchell standing, tears streaming down her face. He killed my baby. He killed her and then he helped us look for her. He spoke at her memorial. Mrs. Mitchell, Judge Harmon said firmly but not unkindly. I understand your pain, but you cannot speak during these proceedings. Please sit down or I'll have to ask you to leave. Tom Mitchell pulled Ellen back into her seat, whispering to her, trying to calm her. But the damage was done. The courtroom buzzed with whispered conversations, people shifting in their seats. The temperature of the room noticeably changed. Judge Harmon gavelled for order. Bail is set at $1 million. Cash or bond. Defendant will surrender his passport and remain within Meridian County if released. Trial date is set for March 15th. This court is adjourned. The gavel came down, and chaos erupted. Reporters shouted questions. Ellen Mitchell collapsed into her husband's arms, sobbing. Dorothy Johnson stood and rushed from the courtroom, her sister following close behind. James was led away by the bailiffs, and Marcus caught a glimpse of his face. Pale, blank, like a man already dead. Outside the courthouse, Marcus pushed through the crowd toward his patrol car. The November air had turned cold, and he could see his breath misting in front of him. Angela Reeves was waiting by the car, her phone pressed to her ear, her expression grim. What is it? Marcus asked. She ended the call. That was the tip line. We've had 47 calls in the past hour. People claiming they saw James Johnson acting suspicious around teenage girls. People saying they always knew something was wrong with him. People reporting that he gave them weird vibes or made inappropriate comments. Marcus felt his stomach sink. Any of them credible? Hard to say. Most of it sounds like hysteria. But there are a couple we need to follow up on. Jennifer Hastings, she graduated in 2006, says Johnson made her uncomfortable during counseling sessions. Kept asking about her dating life, whether she had a boyfriend, whether she was being careful. That could be legitimate guidance counseling, Marcus said. But even as he said it, he knew how it would sound now, in light of the charges. Everything James Johnson had ever done would be re-examined through the lens of suspicion. There's more, Angela continued. Brian Sawyer, graduated in 2010, says Johnson gave him a ride home one night after a basketball game. Took a route that Brian thought was strange. Drove past the old quarry. Asked Brian if he'd ever been skinny dipping there. Marcus closed his eyes. We need to interview them both. Document everything. But Angela, we need to be careful. People are scared and angry. and memories get twisted when everyone's looking for a monster. You think he's innocent? Angela asked. Marcus opened his eyes and looked back at the courthouse, where reporters were now interviewing Ellen Mitchell on the steps. I think the DNA doesn't lie. But I also think James Johnson doesn't fit the profile of someone who commits this kind of crime and then successfully hides it for 16 years. Something about this doesn't add up. At the Meridian County High School, Principal Helen Watkins called an emergency assembly. Every student, every teacher, every staff member packed into the gymnasium that smelled of sweat and floor polish and institutional anxiety. Helen stood at the center of the basketball court, a microphone in her shaking hand, trying to find words that could make sense of the senseless. By now, you've all heard the news about Mr. Johnson, she began. I know many of you are confused, angry, scared. I want you to know that the school is providing counselors. She paused, the irony of the word counselor hanging in the air. Mental health professionals from the county who can talk to anyone who needs support. In the bleachers, 17-year-old Maya Peterson sat between her two best friends, Kayla and Jen. Maya had been to Mr. Johnson's office just last week, crying about her SAT scores, worried she wouldn't get into her dream school. He'd been so kind, so reassuring. He'd told her she was capable of more than she knew, that one bad test didn't define her future. Do you think he really did it? Kayla whispered. Maya didn't know what to think. Her phone buzzed, her mom, checking in again. Her mom had already told her that morning that she was never to be alone with any male teacher, that trust was a luxury they couldn't afford anymore. If he killed Sarah Mitchell, Jen said quietly, then who else might he have hurt? What if we're all just lucky he didn't? Don't. Maya cut her off. She couldn't process that thought, couldn't reconcile the man who'd helped her with the monster everyone was now saying he was. Across the gym, teacher Lisa Chun stood with the other staff members. She'd worked with James for 12 years, had considered him a friend. They'd been on the curriculum committee together, had shared lunch duty, had collaborated on programs to support at-risk students. She'd been to his house for dinner. Dorothy had taught her son in 2nd grade. I can't believe it, Lisa whispered to the art teacher, David Kim, who stood beside her. The DNA, David started. I know what the DNA says, but James? I've seen him with students 1,000 times. He's never been anything but appropriate, professional, caring. Maybe we only saw what we wanted to see, David said darkly. That thought would echo through the halls of Meridian County High for weeks to come. Teachers second-guessed every interaction they'd witnessed, every moment they'd thought was innocuous. The school board called an emergency meeting and placed 2 other male counselors on administrative leave pending review of their files. Parents demanded new policies, new oversight, background checks every year instead of just at hiring. The fear spread like oil on water, touching everything, changing everything. At First Baptist Church, Reverend Martin Hayes faced his own reckoning. The church board had called a meeting Sunday afternoon, packed into the conference room that still had pictures on the wall from the youth mission trip to Honduras, a trip James Johnson had chaperoned. People are leaving the church, board member Richard Dalton said. 10 families this week alone. They're saying we should have known, should have done something. James has been a member of this congregation for 30 years, Martin said, his voice heavy with exhaustion. He's taught Sunday school, led Bible studies, volunteered for every service project we've ever done. What were we supposed to know? What signs did we miss? Sarah Mitchell's family has been part of this church since before she was born. Another board member, Carol Brennan, said quietly. Ellen can't even come to services anymore. She sees James in every corner, every memory. We need to make a statement, distance ourselves. Distance ourselves from a man who hasn't been convicted? Martin interrupted. What happened to innocent until proven guilty? What happened to Grace? Grace. Richard's face flushed red. A 17-year-old girl is dead. If James did this, if he stood up at her memorial and lied to all of us, then Grace is the last thing he deserves. The room fell silent. Martin looked around at the faces of people he'd known for years, people who came to church every Sunday and sang hymns about forgiveness and redemption. And he saw fear in their eyes, fear that their judgment had been wrong, that evil could wear a friendly face, that safety was an illusion. "We'll issue a statement," Martin finally said. "We'll say that we're cooperating with the investigation, that our prayers are with the Mitchell family, and that we trust the justice system. But I won't condemn a man before his trial." After the meeting ended and everyone had left, Martin sat alone in the conference room. He thought about the sermon he'd given just 2 weeks ago about bearing false witness, about the danger of judgment without knowledge. He'd seen James in the congregation that day, nodding along, taking notes the way he always did. Had James been sitting there knowing what he'd done? Or was he sitting there innocent, with no idea that his entire life was about to collapse? Martin didn't know. And not knowing, that was perhaps the hardest part of all. Angela Reeves sat across from Jennifer Hastings in a small interview room at the sheriff's department. Jennifer was 29 now, worked as a dental hygienist in Birmingham, had driven 2 hours to give her statement. She kept twisting her wedding ring around her finger, nervous energy radiating from her. "Tell me about your interactions with Mr. Johnson," Angela said gently, her notebook open. Jennifer took a deep breath. "It was my junior year. I was having some problems at home. My parents were fighting a lot, heading toward divorce. My guidance counselor was Mrs. Patterson, but she was on maternity leave, so they assigned me to Mr. Johnson temporarily." "How did those sessions go?" "At first, fine. He was nice, asked about how I was coping, gave me some resources for dealing with stress. But then," Jennifer paused, choosing her words carefully. "Then he started asking more personal questions. About my dating life. Whether I had a boyfriend. Whether I was sexually active." Angela kept her expression neutral. "Did that feel inappropriate to you at the time?" "I didn't know. I was 16. I thought maybe it was normal, maybe he was supposed to ask those things to make sure I was being safe. But looking back now, with everything that's happened," Jennifer's eyes filled with tears. "What if I wasn't the only one? What if he was grooming girls, and we were all too young or too trusting to see it? Did Mr. Johnson ever touch you inappropriately?" "No, never. It was just the questions, the way he looked at me sometimes. Like he was studying me too closely, paying too much attention." Angela made notes. After Jennifer left, she sat in the interview room alone, thinking about the nature of memory and trauma. Jennifer might be telling the absolute truth about how those interactions felt in retrospect. But memory was unreliable, especially when contaminated by suggestion and hindsight. A look that seemed benign at 16 could take on sinister meaning at 29, when you learned your former counselor was accused of murder. But Angela also knew that predators often tested boundaries gradually, normalized inappropriate behavior before escalating. If James Johnson had killed Sarah Mitchell, it was unlikely to be his first inappropriate interaction with a student. The problem was distinguishing between genuine warning signs and the rewriting of history through the lens of fear. Brian Sawyer came in later that afternoon. He was 28, worked construction, still lived in Meridian County with his wife and 2 kids. He seemed less certain than Jennifer, kept prefacing his statements with, "I might be remembering this wrong," and "it might have been nothing." "It was after a basketball game," Brian said. "Late, maybe 10 o'clock. My mom was supposed to pick me up, but she called and said her car broke down. Mr. Johnson offered me a ride home." "Was that unusual?" Marcus asked. He'd taken over this interview, wanting to hear Brian's account firsthand. "Not really. Teachers gave kids rides sometimes if there was a problem. It was a small town, you know? Everyone kind of looked out for each other." "So what made this ride memorable?" Brian shifted in his seat. "He took a weird route, went past the old quarry instead of the direct way to my house. And he asked me if I'd ever been swimming there, if kids still went out there at night. I said yeah, sometimes in the summer. And he said," Brian paused, his brow furrowing. "He said something like, 'Bet you guys have fun out there, pretty girls in bikinis,' or something like that. It made me uncomfortable, but I just laughed it off and changed the subject." "Did anything else happen?" "No. He dropped me at my house, said goodnight, drove away." I never really thought about it again until I heard about his arrest. Then it felt weird, you know? Like maybe there was something off about him that I'd sensed but ignored. After Brian left, Marcus leaned back in his chair. The interviews were piling up. 8 more scheduled for tomorrow, a dozen more after that. People were coming out of the woodwork with stories about James Johnson, and Marcus couldn't tell which ones were genuine concerns and which were just people wanting to be part of the story, wanting their own brush with evil to make sense of the senselessness. Angela knocked on his door and stepped inside. We got the warrant approved for Johnson's house and computer. Tech team is going through everything now. Find anything? Not yet. His computer history is pretty boring: news sites, educational resources, email to students and parents that all look completely professional. No porn, no suspicious searches, nothing that raises red flags. What about the house? Clean. Too clean, maybe. Dorothy says James was always neat, organized to the point of being obsessive. Every book alphabetized, every file labeled. They're checking for hidden compartments, false walls, anything that might have been used to hide evidence. Marcus rubbed his tired eyes. We're at 4 days since the arrest. If there was evidence in that house, he would have destroyed it in the 16 years he's had. Unless he kept trophies, Angela said quietly. Killers do that sometimes. Can't help themselves. Marcus thought about James Johnson sitting in his cell, maintaining his innocence. If he'd kept trophies, if he'd hidden Sarah Mitchell's belongings somewhere in his pristine house or his organized office, then he truly was a monster wearing a mask of civility. But if he was innocent, if the DNA evidence was somehow wrong or contaminated or misinterpreted, then they were destroying an innocent man's life while the real killer remained free. The phone on Marcus's desk rang. It was the front desk. Sheriff, you need to come see this. Now. Marcus and Angela hurried to the lobby, where a crowd had gathered outside. Through the glass doors, Marcus could see dozens of people holding signs, candles flickering in the cold evening air. It was a vigil for Sarah Mitchell, but it was also something more, a demand for justice, for protection, for someone to make sense of a world where trusted authority figures could be monsters. Ellen Mitchell stood at the front of the crowd, a framed photo of Sarah clutched to her chest. Tom was beside her, along with members of their extended family and friends. Someone had set up a microphone and speakers. Marcus stepped outside. The crowd quieted. We're here for Sarah, Ellen said, her voice amplified and shaking. We're here because for 16 years, we didn't know who took our daughter from us. We didn't know if we'd passed her killer on the street, if we'd shaken his hand at church, if we'd trusted him with our children. Tears streamed down her face. Now we know. James Johnson took Sarah from us. And we need to make sure he never has the chance to hurt anyone else's child. The crowd erupted in agreement. Marcus saw faces he recognized. Parents, teachers, community leaders, all united in their anger and fear. We're asking Sheriff Webb to investigate whether there are other victims, Ellen continued. We're asking the school board to review every student interaction James Johnson ever had. We're asking this community to stop protecting monsters and start protecting children. The crowd cheered. Marcus felt the weight of their expectations pressing down on him. They wanted certainty in an uncertain world. They wanted a villain they could point to, a danger they could eliminate. And James Johnson, sitting in a cell claiming innocence, was the perfect target for all their collective fear and rage. That night, Dorothy Johnson sat in her sister's kitchen in Birmingham, staring at a cup of tea that had long since gone cold. Susan had been wonderful, letting Dorothy and the kids stay with her, creating space for them to process the impossible situation. But Dorothy felt hollowed out, like someone had reached inside her and removed everything essential, leaving only a shell. You need to eat something? Susan said gently, setting a plate of crackers and cheese on the table. Dorothy couldn't remember the last time she'd been hungry. Did you see the news? The vigil? Don't watch that. It's not going to help. But Dorothy had watched it. She'd seen Ellen Mitchell's face, twisted with grief and rage, calling James a monster. And part of Dorothy understood. If their positions were reversed, if someone had taken Sarah or Michael or Emma, Dorothy would want blood too. She'd want someone to pay for the unthinkable loss. But this was James. Her James. The man who'd held her hand during labor, who'd cried when each of their babies were born, who'd driven her to chemotherapy appointments when she'd had breast cancer 8 years ago and sat with her through every treatment, reading to her, making her laugh when she felt too sick to smile. How could that man be the same person who'd killed a teenage girl? I keep going over everything in my mind, Dorothy said, looking for signs I missed, for moments that should have told me something was wrong. But I can't find them, Susan. I can't find any evidence that James is capable of violence. The DNA. I know about the DNA, but DNA doesn't explain motive. It doesn't explain why. James loved his work, loved helping kids. Why would he hurt Sarah Mitchell? Susan sat down across from her sister. Sometimes people have sides we don't see. Secret lives, hidden urges. Don't, Dorothy said sharply. Don't tell me I didn't know my own husband. We've been married 32 years. You don't hide something like this for 32 years. But even as she said it, Dorothy felt doubt creeping in. Because the statistics were undeniable. Wives didn't know, children didn't know, friends and neighbors were always shocked when someone was arrested for terrible crimes. He seemed so normal, they always said. We never suspected a thing. Was she one of those deluded spouses, blind to the truth? Or was James truly innocent, caught in a nightmare not of his making? Dorothy's phone buzzed. Another message from a friend. Well, former friend. Telling her she was praying for Dorothy, but also implying that Dorothy must have known something, must have ignored warning signs. The messages had been coming nonstop since the arrest. Some supportive but more accusatory. How could you not know? You must have suspected. You should have protected us. As if Dorothy had any power over what James did when he wasn't with her. As if marriage came with the ability to read minds and see into souls. Her daughter Sarah called. Dorothy answered on the second ring. Mom, I saw the vigil on the news, Sarah said. She was crying. This is insane. Dad couldn't have done this. I know, sweetheart. No, Mom, I mean it. I know Dad. We all know him. He's not capable of this. Dorothy wanted to believe that with the same certainty her daughter had. But 30 years of being a teacher had taught her that people were capable of surprising things, both wonderful and terrible. She'd seen kids from good families make terrible choices, and kids from broken homes rise above every obstacle. Human behavior defied easy categorization. The trial is in March, Dorothy said. We'll get through this. Your father will have his chance to defend himself. What if that's not enough? Sarah asked. What if everyone's already decided he's guilty? What if the DNA evidence is all they need? Dorothy didn't have an answer. She'd been asking herself the same questions since the moment Marcus Webb had walked into James's office with those handcuffs. After hanging up, Dorothy went to the guest room where she was staying. She pulled out her laptop and opened James's email. She knew his password. They'd never had secrets. She read through months of correspondence with students, parents, colleagues. Every email was professional, appropriate, kind. There were messages from students thanking him for his help, parents praising his dedication, teachers asking for his input on difficult situations. She found the emails with Sarah Mitchell. The girl had written to him several times in September 2008, asking about college applications, scholarship opportunities. James's responses were helpful but brief, encouraging but not overly familiar. Nothing inappropriate. Nothing that suggested anything other than a counselor doing his job. So where was the monster everyone was now saying he'd been? Where was the predator, the killer, the man who'd betrayed every principle he claimed to hold? Dorothy closed the laptop and lay back on the bed. She thought about the James she knew, the man who cried at sad movies, who left notes in her lunch bag after they'd had an argument, who'd built birdhouses with their kids and taught them to ride bikes and never missed a school play or soccer game. That man couldn't have killed Sarah Mitchell. But then who did? Christina Torres sat in her office at 2 a.m., surrounded by case files and empty coffee cups. The evidence against James Johnson was circumstantial despite the DNA. Yes, his hair was found at the scene, but there was no body, no weapon, no witnesses, no confession. Everything hung on that single strand of hair and the narrative the prosecution would build around it. She'd been going through the original case file, studying the investigation from 2008. The lead detective back then had been Bill Crawford, who'd since retired to Florida. Christina had called him 3 times, but he hadn't returned her calls. That wasn't unusual. Retired cops didn't always want to revisit old cases, but something about his silence bothered her. The crime scene photos showed Sarah Mitchell's bedroom exactly as it had been found the morning after she disappeared. Bed made, backpack by the door, homework still spread across her desk. The window that would later yield the crucial DNA evidence was closed but unlocked, a detail that had seemed insignificant at the time but now formed the centerpiece of the prosecution's case. Christina pulled up the evidence log. The hair sample had been collected by Deputy Frank Martinez on October 16, 2008, 2 days after Sarah's disappearance. It had been photographed, documented, placed in an evidence envelope, and stored in the evidence room at the sheriff's department. The chain of custody showed it had been tested in 2008 with the technology available then. Mitochondrial DNA analysis that could exclude suspects but not definitively identify them. The sample had then sat untouched until this year, when Sheriff Webb had authorized new testing using more advanced methods. Christina made a note. Who had access to the evidence room over those 16 years? Could the sample have been contaminated or tampered with? Her phone rang. At 2 a.m., it could only be bad news or a break in the case. She answered. Ms. Torres? This is Bill Crawford. You've been calling about the Mitchell case. Christina sat up straight, suddenly alert. Detective Crawford, thank you for calling back. I'm defending James Johnson, and I have some questions about the original investigation. There was a long pause. I figured that's why you were calling. Look, I'll tell you the same thing I told Webb when he reopened the case. We did everything by the book in 2008. We collected evidence properly, interviewed everyone who might have information, followed every lead until they dried up. I'm not questioning your professionalism, Christina said carefully, but I'm wondering if there are details that might help my client. The hair sample, for instance. Can you walk me through exactly how it was collected? Another pause. Martinez found it caught on the window frame. Exterior side about shoulder height for an average man. He photographed it in place, then used tweezers to transfer it to an evidence envelope. Textbook procedure. Were there other samples collected from the window? Standard dusting for prints, but the window had been wiped clean. No prints, no other trace evidence except that one hair. Christina frowned. That's strange, isn't it? A window in a teenage girl's room, and there are no fingerprints at all. We thought so too, suggested premeditation. Someone careful enough to wipe down their entry point. Or someone cleaning windows, Christina countered. Mrs. Mitchell confirmed she'd washed the windows that week, right? That's in the report. But the hair was on the outside, wedged in the frame. It wouldn't have been there before the window washing. Christina made more notes. Detective Crawford, can I ask you something off the record? Depends on the question. Did you ever consider James Johnson a suspect back in 2008? The silence stretched so long Christina thought the call had dropped. Then Crawford spoke, his voice heavy. We looked at everyone who'd had contact with Sarah in the weeks before she disappeared. Teachers, family friends, neighbors, even the kid who worked with her at the Piggly Wiggly. Johnson was on the list because Sarah had been to his office several times. We interviewed him, cleared him. He had an alibi. His wife confirmed he was home that night. So what changed? Why is that same alibi not holding up now? I can't speak to that. You'd have to ask Webb. But Ms. Torres. Crawford hesitated. I will say this. 16 years is a long time. Memories fade. People's certainties become less certain. If I was defending Johnson, I'd be looking very carefully at how that alibi was documented then versus how it's being characterized now. After the call ended, Christina pulled out the original interview transcript from October 2008. James Johnson had been interviewed on October 17th, 3 days after Sarah's disappearance. He'd been cooperative, visibly upset, eager to help. When asked about his whereabouts on the night of October 14th, he'd stated he was home with his wife. They'd watched television, gone to bed around 10 p.m. Dorothy had been interviewed separately and confirmed the same timeline. But Christina noticed something. Neither statement included specific details about what they'd watched, what they'd talked about, the kind of concrete memories that made an alibi solid. It was the kind of vague recollection people had about routine evenings, nothing notable to anchor the memory. She pulled up the current statements from the prosecution's file. In his initial interview after the arrest, James had expressed uncertainty about his exact whereabouts that evening. "It was 16 years ago. I think I was home, but I can't be completely certain." Dorothy's statement was similar. "I believe James was home, but I can't swear to it with absolute certainty after all this time." The prosecution would argue this uncertainty was suspicious, evidence of a guilty conscience. But Christina saw it differently. It was the honest response of people trying to remember a specific evening 16 years in the past when nothing particularly memorable had happened. She made a note to subpoena Dorothy Johnson as a defense witness and to bring in an expert on memory and the reliability of alibis over long time periods. The next morning, Sheriff Marcus Webb got a call from the state crime lab. Dr. Patricia Chen, the DNA analyst who'd processed the sample, wanted to speak with him directly. "Sheriff, I need to clarify something about the evidence in the Johnson case," Dr. Chen said. "The DNA match we found is definitive. The hair does belong to James Johnson. But there's something about the sample itself that's been bothering me." Marcus felt his pulse quicken. "What is it?" "The condition of the hair suggests it wasn't naturally shed. It was pulled out, you can see the root bulb is intact, and there's evidence of force in the microscopy. Now, that could mean it was forcibly removed during a struggle. But it could also mean something else." "Like what?" "Like it was deliberately planted. If someone had access to James Johnson's DNA, a hairbrush for instance, they could have pulled a hair and placed it at the scene. It would be risky, you'd need to know enough about evidence collection to make it look natural, but it's possible." Marcus leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. "But the sample was collected in 2008. Are you suggesting someone planted evidence 16 years ago?" "I'm not suggesting anything about when it might have been planted. I'm just saying that the physical characteristics of the sample are consistent with it being pulled from a brush rather than naturally shed at the scene. I wanted you to have that information." After the call ended, Marcus sat in silence. If Dr. Chun was right, it opened up an entirely new possibility. James Johnson might actually be innocent. Someone might have framed him, either in 2008 or more recently by tampering with the evidence. But who? And why? Marcus called Angela into his office and shared what he'd learned. "We need to go back through the original investigation with fresh eyes," he said. "Who had motive to hurt Sarah Mitchell? Who had opportunity? And who might have wanted to frame James Johnson?" Angela pulled up the case file on her tablet. In 2008, they looked at Sarah's boyfriend, Derrick Patterson. He was 19, worked at the auto parts store. They'd been dating about 6 months, and according to friends, Sarah was thinking about breaking up with him. What was his alibi? Working late at the store, confirmed by his boss. But Marcus, his uncle, is Judge Patterson, the same judge who signed our warrant for Johnson's arrest. Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. "Keep going." There was also Sarah's English teacher, Mr. Pemberton. Some students mentioned he'd been paying extra attention to Sarah, keeping her after class, making comments about her appearance. But he left town in 2009, moved to Georgia. We never followed up because he didn't seem like a strong suspect. Find him. I want to know where he's been and what he's been doing. And Marcus, there's one more thing. Angela pulled up a different file. In 2007, a year before Sarah disappeared, there was a complaint filed against the high school. A girl named Rebecca Torres, no relation to Christina, claimed she was being harassed by someone. She refused to give details, said she was scared. The complaint went nowhere because she wouldn't name names or provide specifics. 2 months later, she transferred to a school in Mobile. Track her down too. If there was a predator in that school, we need to know. As Angela left to make calls, Marcus stared at the growing list of alternative suspects and scenarios. For 16 years, the case had been cold because they'd had no leads. Now they had what seemed like solid evidence against James Johnson. But every thread they pulled revealed more complexity, more possibilities, more reasons to question the neat narrative of guilt. His phone rang again. It was Frank Martinez, the deputy who'd collected the original DNA evidence. He'd retired 5 years ago and moved to Pensacola. "Sheriff, I heard you're working the Mitchell case again. Heard you arrested Johnson." "That's right, Frank. Based on the hair sample you collected in 2008. "Yeah, about that." Martinez sounded uncomfortable. "I need to tell you something I should have reported at the time, but didn't because I wasn't sure it mattered." Marcus's grip tightened on the phone. "I'm listening. When I collected that hair from the window frame, there was something odd about it. It was positioned too perfectly, you know? Like it had been placed there rather than caught there naturally. I mentioned it to Crawford, but he said I was overthinking it, that evidence is evidence. But it's bothered me all these years. Why didn't you document this?" "I did, in my personal notes. But I never put it in the official report because Crawford was lead detective and he said not to introduce speculation. We were under a lot of pressure to find Sarah, to find answers. I didn't want to complicate things with theories." Marcus thanked Martinez and hung up. Then he pulled out the case file and read through every page, looking for other details that might have been dismissed or overlooked. And he found something that made his blood run cold. On October 15, 2008, the day after Sarah disappeared, there had been a break-in at the school. Someone had accessed the administrative offices, though nothing appeared to have been stolen. The incident had been written off as vandalism, probably students, never fully investigated. But James Johnson's office was in the administrative wing. And James Johnson would have had personal items in that office: a jacket, a coffee mug, possibly even a hairbrush in his desk drawer. Marcus called Angela back. "I need you to find out who responded to that school break-in in 2008. And I need to know if anyone checked Johnson's office to see if anything was disturbed." Within an hour, Angela had the answer. The responding officer had been Deputy Ray Morrison, who still worked for the department. Ray confirmed that he'd checked the offices and found some files scattered in the administrative area, but nothing obviously stolen. He hadn't specifically checked James Johnson's office because it hadn't appeared to be disturbed. "But you didn't look inside the desk drawers?" Marcus asked. "No, sir. No sign of forced entry to individual offices. So I assumed it was just someone being destructive in the common areas." Marcus felt pieces clicking into place. If someone had broken into the school the day after Sarah disappeared, if they'd accessed James Johnson's office, they could have taken something with his DNA on it. A brush, a comb, even fibers from his jacket. Then they could have planted that evidence at the Mitchell house, knowing it would eventually be found and tested. But this raised even more questions. Who would have done this? Someone with knowledge of evidence collection and police procedure. Someone who wanted James Johnson to take the fall for Sarah's disappearance. Someone who'd been willing to wait 16 years for technology to catch up and seal James's fate. Marcus looked at his team, Angela, Ray, Thomas. He thought about all the people who'd been involved in the original investigation, all the people who'd had access to the evidence over the years. And he realized that solving Sarah Mitchell's murder meant not just proving who killed her, but also proving who'd tried to frame James Johnson. And those might be two different people. Christina Torres requested an emergency hearing. Judge Harmon granted it for the following afternoon. The courtroom was packed again, but this time the energy was different. Uncertain, questioning. Christina stood before the bench. "Your Honor, new information has come to light that fundamentally changes the nature of the evidence against my client. We have testimony from the original evidence collector that the hair sample appeared to be positioned rather than naturally shed. We have confirmation from a DNA analyst that the hair shows signs of being forcibly removed, consistent with being taken from a brush. And we have evidence of a break-in at the high school one day after Sarah Mitchell disappeared. A break-in that gave someone access to Mr. Johnson's office." District Attorney Phillips shot to his feet. "Your Honor, this is speculation and desperation. The defense is grasping at straws. The defense is presenting reasonable doubt," Christina interrupted. "The prosecution's entire case rests on that single hair. If that hair was planted, if someone deliberately framed James Johnson, then there's not just reasonable doubt, there's actual innocence." Judge Harmon looked at both attorneys. "Do you have evidence to support the theory that the sample was planted?" "We have circumstantial evidence suggesting it's possible." We're requesting that the court allow us to investigate the original crime scene, to interview the original investigators, and to depose anyone who had access to the evidence over the past 16 years. Granted, Judge Harmon said. Mr. Phillips, you'll cooperate fully. This case has gotten complicated, and I want to make sure justice is served. For Sarah Mitchell and for Mr. Johnson, whoever that justice favors. As they left the courtroom, Christina saw Ellen Mitchell in the hallway. The woman looked devastated, and Christina understood why. For 3 weeks, Ellen had believed they'd finally found Sarah's killer. Now that certainty was crumbling, and she was back in the nightmare of not knowing. This story chronicles a wrongful accusation that devastated multiple lives and ultimately transformed a community's approach to justice. In October 2008, 17-year-old Sarah Mitchell disappeared from her Meridian County, Alabama home. Her body was never found, but shoes by a creek suggested drowning. The case went cold until 16 years later when advanced DNA technology identified a hair on her window frame belonging to James Johnson, the school's guidance counselor who had helped Sarah with college applications. James, a 64-year-old man with 3 decades of unblemished service, was arrested based on this seemingly irrefutable evidence. His life collapsed instantly. Students recoiled in horror, colleagues avoided eye contact, and the community he'd served turned against him. His wife Dorothy stood by him, but their children faced harassment, and James spent weeks in jail watching his reputation disintegrate. Defense attorney Christina Torres took his case, disturbed by how a single piece of forensic evidence had convinced everyone of his guilt without corroborating evidence. The investigation revealed troubling inconsistencies. Sarah had documented in her diary that someone was stalking her, referring to this person as D and expressing fear. Deputy Daniel Foster, the former school resource officer, eventually confessed he'd withheld information. Sarah had reported being followed and watched by someone who knew intimate details about her life, but Foster stayed silent to protect himself from exposure of an inappropriate relationship with a student's mother. This revelation shifted the investigation's direction. Investigators discovered Jacob Brennan, the head custodian who had access to every room including Johnson's office, had been secretly photographing Sarah and other female students. His widow Carol found these photos after his death in 2015, but burned them to protect his reputation, keeping only one as proof. She confided only in her brother Richard Dalton, who urged destroying all evidence to preserve the family's standing. This knowledge became crucial when investigators realized someone with access to Johnson's office could have stolen his hair to plant at the crime scene. The breakthrough came from Richard Dalton himself, who finally revealed he'd witnessed someone carrying a wrapped bundle to a car on the night Sarah disappeared. A dark blue sedan with a license plate starting with JK7. This detail contradicted Johnson's vehicle and pointed to Derrick Patterson, Sarah's boyfriend, who drove exactly such a car. When confronted, Derrick fled but was quickly apprehended and confessed to killing Sarah during an argument about their relationship ending. He'd strangled her accidentally while trying to silence her screams, then disposed of her body in a quarry and staged evidence suggesting she'd run away. However, Derrick knew nothing about the planted DNA evidence. The trail led to Judge Patterson, Derrick's uncle, who had provided the false alibi in 2008 and later planted Johnson's hair at the crime scene when advancing DNA technology threatened to solve the case. The judge believed he was protecting his nephew from a punishment he didn't deserve while ensuring Johnson would eventually be exonerated. Confronted with evidence of tampering and Richard Dalton's testimony, Judge Patterson resigned and confessed to evidence manipulation. James was released after weeks in jail, all charges dropped. The reunion with his family was bittersweet. Freedom couldn't erase the trauma of public accusation or restore what had been lost. The school board offered reinstatement, but James declined, unable to return to a place where he'd been let out in handcuffs. Instead, he founded the Second Chances Project, a nonprofit helping the wrongfully accused navigate the legal system and rebuild their lives. Ellen and Tom Mitchell, Sarah's parents, struggled with the revelation that they'd been wrong about Johnson while learning the true killer had been someone they'd welcomed into their home. Ellen eventually apologized to James, acknowledging he'd been kind to their daughter and encouraging her dreams when they tried to keep her world small. They established the Sarah Mitchell Memorial Scholarship, which would eventually fund over 100 students pursuing education. The case's ripple effects transformed Alabama's criminal justice system. Marcus Webb, the sheriff who arrested Johnson, retired haunted by how close he'd come to destroying an innocent life. His successor, Angela Reeves, implemented new protocols emphasizing skepticism and thorough verification. Christina Torres became a judge known for demanding rigorous standards before allowing prosecutions to proceed. Maya Peterson, Johnson's former student, became a defense attorney specializing in difficult cases, inspired by watching her mentor's grace under pressure. James published a memoir that led to the James Johnson Act, comprehensive legislation requiring independent verification of forensic evidence, blind testing procedures to prevent bias, and state-level review boards for cases involving new technology. The law prevented 17 wrongful convictions and helped overturn 23 others. His Second Chances project expanded to 8 states, freeing 247 innocent people from prison over the following decades. The personal costs remained steep. The Johnson children moved away, unable to live where their father's face had been branded as a murderer's. Dorothy retired from teaching after parents questioned her judgment. James and Dorothy stayed in Meridian County despite everything, refusing to let false accusations drive them from their home. Their marriage, tested beyond imagination, emerged stronger through the ordeal. Sarah's legacy evolved beyond tragedy. The memorial garden at her high school became a place for reflection on justice and judgment. Students learned her story not just as a cautionary tale but as a catalyst for systemic change. Derrick Patterson served 25 years for manslaughter, writing unread apology letters to the Mitchells. Judge Patterson faced charges for evidence tampering. Richard Dalton performed community service, his reputation destroyed by complicity in covering up his brother-in-law's crimes. Years later, Ellen Mitchell shared Sarah's diary with James, revealing an entry expressing gratitude for his belief in her dreams and his permission to want more than her parents' limited vision for her life. This conversation represented a kind of healing, acknowledgement that James had given Sarah hope in her final weeks, that his encouragement had been a gift rather than the betrayal Ellen had once imagined. James died at 84, having transformed his worst experience into purpose. His funeral drew hundreds whose lives he'd touched, freed exonerees, trained attorneys, inspired students. He was buried near Sarah Mitchell's grave, white roses mysteriously planted between their plots, symbolizing how 2 lives intertwined through tragedy had found resolution. 40 years after Sarah's death, high school students still study the case, learning that science can be weaponized, evidence can be planted, and systems can fail catastrophically. The lesson isn't distrust but skepticism, demanding proof, insisting on thoroughness, remembering that behind every accusation stands a human being whose life hangs in the balance. The Sarah Mitchell Memorial Scholarship continues funding students. The James Johnson Act continues preventing wrongful convictions. And in courtrooms across Alabama, when forensic evidence seems definitive and guilt seems obvious, there are always those who pause, remember, and ask one more question, because they learned from Sarah Mitchell that victims deserve justice, and from James Johnson that sometimes the accused is a victim too. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel.